They all describe the same impossible details: the metallic taste that fills your mouth, the humming that seems to come from inside your skull, the moment when time simply stops. Tonight, I'm sharing 14 accounts from people who experienced something that shouldn't exist. Truck drivers who lost hours on empty highways, families who woke up in places they'd never been, ordinary people whose lives were forever changed by encounters with the unexplained. Welcome to Arcade Recaps. I'm your host, and these stories come from across decades and continents, yet they share disturbing similarities that science can't explain and governments won't acknowledge. Before we dive into these encounters, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Now find a comfortable spot, dim the lights, and prepare for accounts that will make you question what's really moving through our skies. Our first account takes us back to 1963, to a quiet suburb in California, where a 17-year-old girl named Sarah Martinez experienced something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Sarah was a typical teenager of her era. She lived with her parents in a modest home on the outskirts of Los Angeles, spent her days at school, and her evenings doing homework or listening to music with friends. She had no particular interest in UFOs or extraterrestrial life. In fact, she'd later describe herself as someone who barely looked up at the stars. That changed on a warm October night when she woke to find her bedroom filled with an otherworldly blue light. At first, she thought it might be police cars or an ambulance outside. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized the light was coming from above, streaming through her second-story window in a way that defied explanation. Sarah tried to move, to call out to her parents sleeping in the next room, but found herself completely paralyzed. Not the kind of sleep paralysis some people experience, but something far more profound. She was fully conscious, fully aware, but her body simply wouldn't respond to her commands. That's when she saw them. 3 figures standing at the foot of her bed, silhouetted against the strange blue radiance. They were small, perhaps 4 feet tall, with disproportionately large heads and eyes that seemed to reflect the eerie light. Their movements were fluid, almost graceful, as they approached her bed. What happened next would be burned into Sarah's memory forever. Without any physical contact, she found herself floating upward, still paralyzed, still unable to speak or cry out. The ceiling of her bedroom seemed to simply disappear, and she was drawn up through what felt like a tunnel of light. The next thing she remembered was being in a circular room with walls that seemed to pulse with their own inner illumination. The air felt thick, almost viscous, and had a metallic taste that made her throat burn. She was lying on what appeared to be a table, though it felt more like being suspended on a cushion of energy than resting on any solid surface. The beings moved around her with purposeful efficiency. Their faces, when she could see them clearly, were unlike anything in her experience. Large, dark eyes that seemed to look right through her. Skin that was pale and smooth, almost translucent. No visible nose, just small openings where nostrils might be, and mouths that were little more than thin slits that never seemed to open. They communicated without speaking, she would later explain to investigators. Not telepathy exactly, but more like emotions and concepts that appeared directly in her mind. She understood that they were examining her, studying her, though she couldn't comprehend why or what they hoped to learn. The examination itself was thorough and invasive. They used instruments she couldn't identify, devices that seemed to emit various types of light and energy. At one point, something was inserted into her nasal cavity, causing intense pressure and pain. She tried to scream, but no sound emerged. Throughout the ordeal, one of the beings stayed close to her head, and she got the impression it was somehow monitoring her emotional state, perhaps trying to keep her calm. Its presence felt ancient, impossibly old, and there was something in those large, dark eyes that suggested intelligence far beyond human understanding. Time seemed to work differently in that place. What felt like hours might have been minutes, or perhaps the reverse. Eventually, the examination ended, and she found herself back in the floating state, being drawn through that tunnel of light once again. She awoke in her own bed as the first rays of dawn were creeping through her window. Her parents were calling her for breakfast, completely unaware that anything unusual had occurred. But Sarah knew something fundamental had changed. She felt different, altered in ways she couldn't articulate. In the days that followed, she developed severe nosebleeds that would come without warning. Her parents took her to several doctors, but none could find a cause. The bleeding would continue sporadically for months before finally stopping, as mysteriously as it had begun. More disturbing were the dreams that started almost immediately after her experience. Night after night, she would find herself back in that circular room, subjected to the same examinations by the same beings. These weren't normal dreams, she insisted to anyone who would listen. They felt real, more real than her waking life. Sarah tried to tell her parents what had happened, but their reaction was predictable. They suggested she'd had a vivid nightmare, perhaps brought on by something she'd eaten or a movie she'd seen. When she persisted, they became concerned about her mental health and arranged for her to see a counselor. The counselor, Dr. Rebecca Williams, was initially skeptical of Sarah's account, but as the sessions continued, she became intrigued by the consistency and detail of the girl's story. Sarah never wavered in her description of events, never embellished or changed details. If anything, she seemed desperate to convince someone, anyone, that what she'd experienced was real. Dr. Williams eventually referred Sarah to a colleague who specialized in unusual psychological cases. This doctor, whose name remains confidential in the files, conducted extensive interviews and even attempted hypnotic regression to help Sarah recover more details from her experience. Under hypnosis, Sarah revealed information that hadn't emerged in her conscious recollections. She described symbols or markings she'd seen on the walls of the spacecraft, drawings that she was able to reproduce with surprising accuracy when she emerged from the hypnotic state. She also recalled conversations, or what passed for conversations, with the beings about the purpose of their visits to Earth. According to Sarah's hypnotically recovered memories, the beings explained that they were studying human development, both physical and psychological. They were particularly interested in human emotions and creativity, qualities they claimed to lack in their own species. They spoke of humanity as being at a critical juncture in its evolution, though they were vague about what that meant. Perhaps most unsettling was their suggestion that Sarah's experience was not unique, that they had been conducting similar examinations on humans for generations. They implied that she had been selected for ongoing study, that this first encounter was merely the beginning of a longer relationship. True to their implied promise, Sarah's experiences didn't end with that first night. Over the following months, she reported several more encounters, though none as vivid or detailed as the initial abduction. Sometimes she would simply wake to find herself in different clothes than she'd worn to bed. Other times she would discover small marks on her body, perfectly round puncture wounds that would heal within days. Her academic performance began to suffer as the encounters continued. She had difficulty concentrating, complained of constant fatigue, and seemed to be in a perpetual state of anxiety. Her parents, growing increasingly concerned, had her examined by numerous medical specialists, but none could find anything physically wrong with her. The breaking point came during her senior year of high school. Sarah arrived at school one morning with no memory of how she'd gotten there. She was wearing her school clothes, but had no recollection of getting dressed, eating breakfast, or making the journey from home. Security footage later showed her walking onto campus at the normal time, but her behavior seemed mechanical, almost robotic. This incident prompted her parents to seek more intensive psychological help. Sarah was eventually referred to Dr. Jonathan Kellner, a psychiatrist who had begun specializing in what were then called anomalous experiences. Dr. Kellner was one of the first mental health professionals to take reports of alien encounters seriously, not as literal truth necessarily, but as genuine psychological phenomena worthy of study. Over the course of 2 years, Dr. Kellner worked with Sarah to understand and cope with her experiences. His notes, which were later made available to researchers, paint a picture of a young woman struggling to maintain her sanity while dealing with experiences that challenged every assumption about reality. What struck Dr. Kellner most was Sarah's fundamental stability in every area except those related to her alleged encounters. She showed no signs of the delusions or thought disorders typically associated with serious mental illness. Her accounts remained consistent across multiple interviews, and she demonstrated a clear understanding of how bizarre her claims sounded to others. Dr. Kellner also noted physical evidence that was difficult to explain. During one session, Sarah arrived with what appeared to be a small implant visible just beneath the skin of her left wrist. X-rays revealed a tiny metallic object, perfectly spherical, embedded in the tissue. When surgically removed, the object was found to be composed of metals not found naturally on Earth, arranged in a crystalline structure that materials scientists couldn't replicate. The implant was sent to several laboratories for analysis, and the results were uniformly baffling. The metal showed no signs of having been manufactured by any known industrial process. Its composition included isotopes that shouldn't have been stable, yet somehow were. Most puzzling of all, the object seemed to emit a faint electromagnetic field that interfered with sensitive electronic equipment. Sarah's case gained attention in academic circles when Dr. Kellner presented his findings at a conference on anomalous psychological phenomena. While many of his colleagues remained skeptical, a small group of researchers began investigating similar cases, looking for patterns and commonalities. What they found was disturbing. Across the country and eventually around the world, researchers began documenting cases remarkably similar to Sarah's. Young people, mostly women, reporting encounters with small grey beings who conducted medical examinations aboard spacecraft. The consistency of details across cases was striking, particularly given that many of the witnesses had no exposure to popular culture depictions of aliens. Sarah herself eventually learned to cope with her experiences, though they never completely stopped. She went on to attend college, where she studied psychology, hoping to better understand what had happened to her. She married, had children, and built what appeared to be a normal life. But those close to her knew that she carried the weight of her encounters with her always. In her later years, Sarah became an advocate for others who claimed similar experiences. She helped establish support groups for abductees and worked with researchers trying to understand the phenomenon. She never wavered in her belief that her encounters were real, but she also never claimed to fully understand what they meant. When Sarah passed away in 2019 at the age of 73, she left behind detailed journals documenting decades of ongoing contact with the beings she first encountered as a teenager. Her final entry, written just days before her death, contained a message she claimed had been given to her by the beings themselves. The message was cryptic, speaking of humanity approaching a time of great change, a moment when the truth about our place in the universe would finally be revealed. Sarah wrote that she had been chosen to help prepare others for this revelation, though she admitted she still didn't fully understand what form it would take. Her story remains one of the most well-documented cases of alleged alien abduction on record. The physical evidence, the psychological profiles, the consistency of her accounts across decades, all combine to create a case that defies easy explanation. Whether you believe her experiences were literal encounters with extraterrestrial beings or something else entirely, there's no denying that something profound happened to Sarah Martinez, something that shaped the entire course of her life. And as we'll see in our next account, Sarah's experience was far from unique. Across the globe, others were reporting remarkably similar encounters, each adding another piece to a puzzle that we're still trying to solve today. Our second story takes us to a small farming community in Iowa, where a family's quiet rural life was shattered by an encounter that would test the bonds of belief and trust. The Henderson family had lived on their corn and soybean farm for 3 generations. Tom Henderson, his wife Marie, and their 2 children, 8-year-old Danny and 12-year-old Lisa knew every acre of their land, every sound their old farmhouse made at night, every rhythm of their predictable agricultural life. They were practical people, rooted in the soil and skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained by common sense and hard work. That changed on a humid August night in 1975, when the entire family experienced something that would fracture their understanding of reality. It began with the animals. Around 10 in the evening, their cattle started behaving strangely, huddling together in the far corner of the pasture, their low moaning carrying across the fields. The family's 3 dogs, usually reliable watchdogs, fell completely silent and hid under the front porch, refusing to come out even when called. Tom went outside to investigate, thinking perhaps a coyote or wild dog was threatening the livestock. The night was unusually still, he would later recall, with no wind moving through the corn stalks that surrounded their property. Even the insects had gone quiet, creating an eerie silence that seemed to press in from all directions. As he walked toward the pasture, Tom noticed a faint glow emanating from somewhere beyond the cornfield. At first, he assumed it was a neighbor's yard light or perhaps someone burning brush, though it seemed too bright and too diffuse for either explanation. The light had an odd quality to it, almost pulsing, like a massive heartbeat made visible. When Tom reached the edge of the cornfield, he stopped in his tracks. The light wasn't coming from ground level, as he'd assumed, but from something hovering silently about 50 feet above the corn. It was enormous, easily the size of their farmhouse, and shaped like nothing he'd ever seen before. The craft, for lack of a better word, was roughly triangular but with rounded edges, and its surface seemed to ripple like liquid mercury in the moonlight. Tom stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The object made no sound, produced no wind, generated no heat that he could feel. It simply hung there in the air, defying every law of physics he understood. Streams of pale blue light occasionally swept across the ground beneath it, illuminating the corn stalks in an otherworldly glow. Back at the house, Marie was putting the children to bed when she noticed the strange light filtering through their bedroom windows. When she looked outside, she saw her husband standing motionless at the edge of their property, silhouetted against the bizarre illumination. She called out to him, but Tom didn't respond. He seemed to be in some kind of trance, staring up at the source of the light. Marie's maternal instincts kicked in, and she quickly gathered Danny and Lisa, telling them to stay close to her as she went outside to get their father. The moment Marie stepped off their front porch, she felt it. A pressure in her head, like diving too deep in a swimming pool, accompanied by a low humming that she felt more than heard. The children clung to her sides, both of them crying softly, though neither could explain why they were frightened. As they approached Tom, the humming grew stronger, and Marie began to feel disoriented. The world around her seemed to shift and blur, as if she were looking at everything through water. Time felt strange, elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. What happened next would remain burned in their collective memory, though each family member would remember it slightly differently. They found themselves no longer standing in their cornfield, but inside a vast, dimly lit space that seemed to have no clear walls or ceiling. The air was thick and humid, with a metallic taste that made their throats burn. They were not alone. Figures moved in the shadows around them, tall and slender with elongated limbs and oversized heads. The beings' movements were fluid, almost dance-like, as they glided rather than walked across the strange, spongy surface beneath their feet. The family huddled together, Tom instinctively putting his arms around his wife and children. None of them could speak, though whether from fear or some external influence, they couldn't tell. The beings seemed to communicate among themselves through a series of clicking sounds and gestures. their large, dark eyes reflecting the dim light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. One of the beings approached them, and Marie would later describe feeling an overwhelming sense of ancient intelligence radiating from its presence. It was smaller than the others, perhaps 5 feet tall, but there was something about its bearing that suggested authority or importance. When it looked at her, she felt as though her mind was being gently probed, her thoughts and memories examined like pages in a book. The being's attention turned to the children, and both Danny and Lisa stepped forward without apparent fear, as if drawn by some invisible force. This terrified Tom and Marie, but they found themselves unable to move or call out as their children were led away by several of the creatures. Time became meaningless in that place. Tom and Marie waited in the strange chamber, surrounded by beings who seemed to be studying them with detached curiosity. Occasionally, one would approach and extend what appeared to be a hand, causing a tingling sensation wherever contact was made. They felt no pain, but the experience was profoundly unsettling, as if their very essence was being catalogued and measured. Eventually, Danny and Lisa were returned to them, both children appearing calm but somehow different. Their eyes held a distant quality, as if they had seen things far beyond their years. When Marie tried to ask them what had happened, they seemed unable to find words to describe their experience. The return journey was as disorienting as their arrival had been. One moment they were in that impossible chamber, surrounded by the silent beings, and the next they were standing in their cornfield again, the strange craft nowhere to be seen. The night was normal once more, filled with the familiar sounds of crickets and rustling corn, but the family knew immediately that something fundamental had changed. When they checked the time, they discovered that 6 hours had passed, though their subjective experience felt like it had lasted perhaps 30 minutes. More disturbing still, they each bore physical evidence of their encounter. Tom found a small, perfectly circular mark on his forearm about the size of a dime that hadn't been there before. The skin around it was slightly raised and had a faint reddish tinge. Marie discovered similar marks on both her wrists, arranged in what appeared to be a triangular pattern. The children each had single marks on their necks, barely visible, but definitely present. The marks caused no pain or discomfort, but they didn't fade over time like normal skin irritations. Years later, they would still be visible, serving as permanent reminders of that night in the cornfield. More profound were the psychological changes the family experienced. Danny, who had been an outgoing, talkative child, became withdrawn and introspective. He spent hours drawing elaborate pictures of beings and spacecraft, images that were far more sophisticated than what you'd expect from an 8-year-old. When asked about his drawings, he would simply say he was drawing his friends. Lisa developed what appeared to be an advanced understanding of mathematics and science that puzzled her teachers. She began speaking about concepts like parallel dimensions and quantum physics, topics she had never encountered in school or at home. Her academic performance soared, but her social connections suffered as she struggled to relate to children her own age. Tom and Marie found their relationship tested in ways they'd never imagined. The shared experience had bonded them in some ways, but it also created a sense of isolation from the rest of their community. How could they explain what had happened without sounding delusional? How could they seek help when they didn't even understand what kind of help they needed? They made the difficult decision to keep their experience secret, at least initially. They told their extended family and friends that they'd all come down with a stomach bug that night, which explained their absence and disorientation. But the burden of carrying such a profound secret began to take its toll. Marie started having nightmares almost immediately after the encounter. She would wake up screaming, describing dreams of being back in that strange chamber, surrounded by the tall beings. Sometimes she would find herself outside the house in the middle of the night, standing in the exact spot where they'd first seen the craft, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. Tom threw himself into his farm work with renewed intensity, as if physical labor could somehow ground him in reality. But he began experiencing episodes where he would lose track of time while working in the fields. He would start a task in the morning and suddenly find himself hours later with no memory of what he'd been doing in between. The children's experiences were perhaps the most troubling. Both Danny and Lisa began having what they called visits from their new friends. These weren't dreams, they insisted, but actual encounters that happened while they were awake. They would describe floating out of their beds at night and being taken to a place they called the learning room, where the beings would show them images and concepts that they were too young to fully understand. These visits became so frequent that Tom and Marie considered seeking professional help, but they were terrified of the potential consequences. In 1975, admitting that your family was experiencing ongoing contact with extraterrestrial beings was a sure path to psychiatric evaluation and possible loss of custody of their children. Instead, they decided to document everything themselves. Marie started keeping a detailed journal of the family's experiences, noting dates, times, and descriptions of each incident. Tom began taking photographs of the marks that appeared on their bodies, as well as any other physical evidence they could find. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence came from an unexpected source. Tom's brother-in-law, a skeptical man who worked as an electrician, visited the farm about a month after the initial encounter. He brought with him an electromagnetic field detector, a device he used to locate wiring problems in buildings. The detector went crazy the moment he walked into the area where the family had first seen the craft. The readings were off the charts, indicating electromagnetic disturbances that shouldn't have existed in the middle of a rural cornfield. Even more puzzling, the readings seemed to form a pattern, strongest at certain points that, when mapped out, created a perfect triangle, roughly the same size as the craft the family had described. Soil samples taken from within this triangle showed unusual mineral compositions and elevated radiation levels that couldn't be explained by any known natural processes. The corn growing in that area had developed abnormally, with stalks that were nearly twice the normal height and ears that contained kernels of unusual colours. Word of these anomalies eventually reached Dr. Margaret Chen, a botanist at the nearby university who specialised in plant mutations. When she visited the Henderson farm to collect her own samples, she was immediately struck by the precision of the affected area and the consistency of the changes in the plant life. Dr. Chen's analysis confirmed the presence of isotopes that shouldn't have been present in the soil, as well as genetic modifications in the corn that appeared to have been induced by some form of directed energy. Her report, published in the obscure agricultural journal, was one of the first scientific papers to document physical evidence potentially related to a UFO encounter. The Henderson family's story might have remained a private struggle if not for an incident that occurred 3 years after their initial encounter. In August of 1978, exactly 3 years to the day after their first experience, the same phenomena returned to their farm. This time, however, they were prepared. Tom had invested in a camera with a telephoto lens and kept it ready at all times. When the familiar glow appeared over their cornfield, he was able to capture several photographs of the craft before the family was once again taken aboard. The photographs, while not perfectly clear due to the lighting conditions, clearly showed a structured object of unknown origin hovering above their property. More importantly, the images provided timestamps that would later prove crucial in verifying the family's account of missing time. This second encounter followed a similar pattern to the first, but the family retained more conscious memory of what transpired. They described being taken to the same chamber-like space, but this time they were able to observe more details of their surroundings and the beings who examined them. The creatures, they noted, seemed to work with a purposeful efficiency that suggested this was a routine procedure for them. The family was separated and subjected to various examinations involving devices that projected different colored lights. The beings seemed particularly interested in the children, spending considerable time studying their neural responses to various stimuli. During this encounter, one of the beings appeared to communicate directly with Marie, not through words, but through images and emotions that appeared in her mind. She described receiving information about the purpose of these visits, though much of what she learned was too complex or abstract for her to fully comprehend or articulate. The message, as best she could interpret it, was that humanity was being studied as part of a long-term project to understand how intelligence and consciousness developed in different species. The beings claimed to be conducting similar studies on other worlds, gathering data that would help them understand the nature of life itself. When the family was returned to their farm, they found that Tom's photographs had been developed, providing them with the first concrete evidence of their experiences. The images, while not definitive proof of extraterrestrial visitation, were compelling enough to attract the attention of researchers who specialized in unexplained phenomena. Dr. Richard Holt, a physicist at a major university who had begun investigating UFO reports from a scientific perspective, visited the Henderson farm in early 1979. His analysis of the photographs, combined with the physical evidence from the landing site and the family's consistent testimony, convinced him that something extraordinary had occurred. Dr. Holt arranged for the entire family to undergo extensive psychological evaluation by a team of mental health professionals. The results were remarkable. All 4 family members showed no signs of delusion, fabrication, or mental illness. Their accounts remained consistent under repeated questioning, and they passed polygraph examinations with no indication of deception. Perhaps most significantly, the children's newfound knowledge and abilities were subjected to rigorous testing. Both Danny and Lisa demonstrated understanding of scientific concepts far beyond their educational level, and their drawings of the beings and spacecraft showed details that were consistent with other reported encounters from around the world. The Henderson family's case became one of the foundational studies in what researchers were beginning to call multiple witness abduction events. Their willingness to submit to scientific scrutiny, combined with the physical evidence and photographic documentation, provided a template for how such cases should be investigated. But their story was far from over. Throughout the 1980s, the family continued to experience periodic encounters, each one documented with increasing precision. They learned to recognize the signs that preceded an abduction: the unusual animal behavior, the electromagnetic disturbances, the subtle changes in air pressure that seemed to herald the arrival of their otherworldly visitors. What emerged from years of documentation was a pattern that suggested these weren't random events, but part of an ongoing study. The beings seemed to be tracking the family's development over time, monitoring how their previous encounters had affected them physically and psychologically. Danny, now in his teens, had developed what could only be described as precognitive abilities. He would often know hours in advance when an encounter was about to occur, describing vivid dreams that invariably proved accurate. His artistic abilities had evolved far beyond normal expectations, and his drawings began to include technical specifications for devices and technologies that wouldn't be invented for decades. Lisa's mathematical abilities continued to astound her teachers. By age 16, she was solving equations that graduate students struggled with, and her understanding of theoretical physics impressed professors at nearby universities. Yet she remained emotionally detached from her peers, as if her consciousness existed partially in some other realm. The psychological toll on Tom and Marie was immense. While they had learned to cope with their experiences, the constant vigilance required to protect their family's secret, combined with the ongoing encounters, left them isolated and exhausted. They aged rapidly during those years, bearing the weight of knowledge that they couldn't share with anyone outside their immediate circle of researchers. Dr. Holt's investigation expanded to include other families in the region, and what he discovered was deeply unsettling. The Hendersons weren't alone. Across a 50-mile radius, dozens of families reported similar experiences, often occurring on the same nights. A pattern emerged of coordinated activity that suggested a systematic study of human beings on a scale that was difficult to comprehend. The implications were staggering. If the reports were accurate, then an unknown intelligence was conducting widespread surveillance and experimentation on human populations, apparently without regard for consent or governmental authority. The scope of the operation suggested resources and capabilities far beyond anything in the human arsenal. As the 1980s progressed, the Henderson family's encounters began to change in character. The beings seemed less interested in physical examinations and more focused on what could only be described as educational sessions. Family members would be taken individually or in small groups to spaces that resembled classrooms, where they were shown images and concepts that expanded their understanding of science, philosophy, and the nature of reality itself. These educational encounters were perhaps the most transformative aspect of their ongoing relationship with the beings. Marie developed an intuitive understanding of healing that led her to become an unofficial medical advisor to their rural community. She could diagnose illnesses with uncanny accuracy and seemed to know instinctively which treatments would be most effective. Tom's farming practices evolved in ways that his neighbors couldn't explain. His crops consistently outperformed those of surrounding farms, not through the use of advanced fertilizers or techniques, but through what appeared to be an almost supernatural understanding of soil conditions and plant biology. Agricultural extension agents who studied his methods found innovations that they couldn't replicate, despite following his procedures exactly. The family's transformation didn't go unnoticed in their small community. While they maintained their cover story and never spoke openly about their encounters, people began to regard them with a mixture of respect and unease. There was something different about the Hendersons, something that set them apart from their neighbors in ways that were difficult to define but impossible to ignore. This brings us to our third account, one that takes us from the rural farmlands of Iowa to the bustling corridors of a major metropolitan hospital, where a night shift nurse encountered something that challenged every assumption about where and when these mysterious visitors might appear. Dr. Patricia Wong had been working as a trauma nurse at Metropolitan General Hospital for 8 years when she experienced what she would later describe as the most extraordinary night of her professional life. It was March 15th, 1982, and she was pulling a double shift in the emergency department during what had been an unusually quiet evening for a Friday night. Patricia was known among her colleagues as unflappable. She had seen everything the city could throw at an emergency room: gunshot wounds, drug overdoses, car accidents, domestic violence cases. Nothing rattled her professional composure, and she prided herself on maintaining clinical objectivity, even in the most chaotic situations. That composure was tested around 2:30 in the morning when she was making her rounds through the recovery ward. The hospital's emergency power system had been acting up all week, causing intermittent fluctuations in the lighting and occasional equipment malfunctions. So when the lights in Ward 7 began to flicker, Patricia assumed it was just another electrical glitch. But as she walked down the corridor, checking on patients who were recovering from various procedures, she noticed that the flickering had a pattern to it. The lights would dim for exactly 3 seconds, return to normal brightness for 2 seconds, then repeat the cycle. It was too regular to be a random malfunction, too precise to be coincidental. More disturbing was the effect this light pattern seemed to have on the patients. Those who were conscious appeared to be in some kind of trance state, staring at the ceiling with unfocused eyes. Even patients who had been sedated were showing unusual brain activity on their monitors, their EEG readings displaying patterns that Patricia had never seen before. She tried to radio the maintenance department about the electrical problem, but her communication device produced only static. The nurse's station phone was similarly affected, emitting a high-pitched whine that made it impossible to use. It was as if some kind of interference was blocking all electronic communications within the ward. As Patricia moved from room to room, checking on her 8 patients, she began to notice other anomalies. The temperature in the corridor seemed to be dropping, though the hospital's climate control system showed normal readings. The air itself felt different, charged with an energy that made her skin tingle and her hair stand on end. In room 714, she found something that stopped her in her tracks. Mr. Kowalski, a 60-year-old construction worker who had been admitted with a broken leg from a job site accident, was floating 6 inches above his hospital bed. He appeared to be unconscious, breathing steadily, but his body was suspended in mid-air as if gravity had simply stopped affecting him. Patricia blinked hard, certain that her exhaustion was causing hallucinations. But when she opened her eyes, Mr. Kowalski was still floating, his hospital gown hanging loosely around his suspended form. She reached out tentatively to touch him, and her hand encountered some kind of invisible field that felt like pushing against warm, thick liquid. Before she could process what she was seeing, Patricia became aware of movement in her peripheral vision. She turned to see 3 figures standing in the doorway of the room, silhouetted against the flickering light of the corridor. They were tall and slender, wearing what appeared to be form-fitting suits that seemed to shimmer like oil on water. The beings moved into the room with fluid grace, paying no attention to Patricia as if she were invisible to them. Their focus was entirely on Mr. Kowalski, and they began to manipulate devices that seemed to materialize in their hands as needed. These instruments emitted various colored lights that played across the floating patient's body, and Patricia could see data appearing on screens that definitely hadn't been in the room moments before. Patricia tried to speak, to challenge these intruders, but found that no sound would emerge from her throat. She could think clearly, could move her eyes, and even shift her weight slightly. But her vocal cords seemed to be paralyzed. It was similar to what she'd heard patients describe during episodes of sleep paralysis, except she was fully awake and standing upright. One of the beings turned its attention to her, and Patricia got her first clear look at their faces. The features were humanoid, but elongated, with large eyes that reflected the strange light from their instruments. The being's gaze felt like a physical presence in her mind, and suddenly she was flooded with images and concepts that weren't her own thoughts. She saw the hospital from above, as if through the eyes of something flying high overhead. She saw other hospitals, other medical facilities around the world, all experiencing similar visitations. She understood, without being told explicitly, that these beings were conducting some kind of medical research, studying human physiology and healing processes in ways that were far beyond current medical knowledge. The images shifted, showing her scenes of advanced medical procedures being performed in environments that looked nothing like earthly hospitals. She saw beings like the ones in her room working alongside humans, sharing knowledge and techniques that could revolutionize healthcare. But she also sensed that this collaboration was still far in the future, dependent on humanity's readiness to accept help from sources beyond their world. As quickly as it had begun, the mental contact ended. The being turned back to its examination of Mr. Kowalski, and Patricia found herself able to move and speak again. But she remained silent, instinctively understanding that she was witnessing something that wasn't meant for her eyes, yet somehow she'd been allowed to observe. The examination continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The beings used their instruments to scan Mr. Kowalski's broken leg, and Patricia watched in amazement as the fracture appeared to heal in real time. The swelling reduced, the bone alignment corrected itself, and the patient's vital signs showed marked improvement. When the procedure was complete, Mr. Kowalski was gently lowered back onto his bed. The beings gathered their equipment, which seemed to dissolve back into nothingness, and moved toward the door. The one who had made mental contact with Patricia paused and looked at her one final time. In that moment, she received a clear message. What she had witnessed was a gift, both to Mr. Kowalski and to her own understanding. She was being entrusted with knowledge that she would need in the years to come. The beings left as silently as they had arrived, and the ward's lighting returned to normal. Patricia rushed to check on Mr. Kowalski, expecting to find him traumatized by his experience, but he was sleeping peacefully, showing no signs of distress. His leg, which had been badly swollen and obviously fractured just hours before, appeared completely normal. She quickly moved through the other rooms in the ward, checking on the remaining patients. All of them were resting comfortably, their vital signs stable, their EEG readings back to normal patterns. Several patients who had been admitted with serious conditions showed remarkable improvement that couldn't be explained by their prescribed treatments. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had been struggling with severe pneumonia, was breathing easily for the first time in days. Her lung X-rays, when compared to films taken just hours earlier, showed complete clearing of the infection. Mr. Rodriguez, a diabetic who had been in a coma due to severe ketoacidosis, was awake and alert, his blood sugar levels perfectly normal. Patricia spent the remainder of her shift documenting these miraculous recoveries. But she knew that no amount of medical records could capture what had really happened in Ward 7 that night. She faced an impossible choice: report what she had witnessed and risk her career and reputation, or remain silent and carry the burden of this knowledge alone. She chose a middle path, documenting the patient's recoveries in detail, while attributing them to the natural healing process and the effectiveness of their prescribed treatments. But she also began her own private investigation, researching similar cases and reaching out to colleagues who might have experienced something similar. What she discovered was both reassuring and disturbing. Patricia wasn't alone in her experience. Across the medical community, there were whispered stories of miraculous healings, of patients who recovered from terminal illnesses overnight, of medical equipment that malfunctioned in ways that seemed almost purposeful. Dr. James Mitchell, an oncologist at a cancer research center, confided in Patricia about a series of cases where patients with advanced tumors had experienced complete remissions that couldn't be explained by their treatments. The recoveries all occurred during the night shift, and in each case, the attending nurses reported electrical disturbances and equipment malfunctions. A pediatric surgeon in California shared stories of children who had undergone complex operations, only to heal with impossible speed and precision. The surgical sites would close without scarring, and complications that should have occurred simply didn't manifest. Again, these exceptional outcomes were invariably associated with unexplained technical difficulties and reports of unusual phenomena. As Patricia delved deeper into this hidden aspect of medical practice, she began to understand that she had witnessed part of a much larger phenomenon. The beings who had visited her ward weren't just studying human medicine, they were actively intervening to save lives and advance healing in ways that human science couldn't yet achieve. This realization brought with it a profound sense of responsibility. Patricia began to modify her own nursing practices, incorporating insights from her encounter in ways that improved patient outcomes without attracting attention from her supervisors. She developed an intuitive sense for which patients needed additional monitoring and which treatments would be most effective. Her success rate became legendary within the hospital. Patients under her care consistently showed better outcomes than statistical models predicted. Colleagues began requesting her assistance with difficult cases, and her reputation as an exceptional nurse spread throughout the medical community. But Patricia knew that her abilities weren't entirely her own. The beings had left something behind, a kind of enhanced understanding that allowed her to perceive aspects of illness and healing that were invisible to conventional medical training. It was both a gift and a burden, connecting her to a reality that existed beyond the boundaries of accepted scientific knowledge. Years later, as Patricia transitioned from active nursing to teaching medical students, she found ways to pass on some of what she had learned. She couldn't tell her students about the beings or the miraculous healing she had witnessed, but she could teach them to be more observant, more intuitive, more open to possibilities that lay beyond the edges of current medical understanding. Her students often commented on her uncanny ability to diagnose problems that other instructors missed, and her success in developing nurses who seemed to have an almost supernatural understanding of patient care. What they didn't know was that Patricia was part of a quiet network of medical professionals who had experienced similar encounters, sharing knowledge and insights that were slowly revolutionizing healthcare from within. The Henderson family's ongoing encounters and Patricia's hospital experience represent just two threads in a tapestry of human contact with intelligence beyond our world. But as we'll see in our next account, these encounters weren't limited to rural farms or urban hospitals. Sometimes they occurred in the most unexpected places, to people who were least prepared to accept what was happening to them. Our fourth story takes us to the Canadian wilderness, where a geological survey team discovered that they weren't alone in the vast expanses of the northern forest, and that their scientific mission had attracted the attention of observers whose technology made their sophisticated equipment seem primitive by comparison. Dr. Michael Thompson had been leading geological surveys for nearly 15 years when he accepted the assignment that would fundamentally alter his understanding of what lived in the remote wilderness of northern Canada. His team of 4 specialists had been contracted by a mining consortium to assess mineral deposits in an area so isolated that it required a 3-day helicopter journey just to reach their base camp. The region they were studying had been largely unexplored by modern science. Indigenous peoples had traditional territories there, but even they rarely ventured into the deepest parts of this particular tract of boreal forest. The area was known for unusual magnetic readings that interfered with navigation equipment, and local guides refused to accompany survey teams beyond certain landmarks that they claimed were protected by spirits. Thompson's team consisted of himself, Dr. Sarah Kim, a mineralogist specializing in rare earth elements, Marcus Rivera, a geophysicist whose equipment could detect mineral formations hundreds of feet below ground, and Jennifer Walsh, a graduate student in geology who served as their technical assistant and data recorder. They were experienced professionals, accustomed to working in remote locations under challenging conditions. Their base camp was established in a clearing beside a pristine lake, surrounded by towering spruce and fir trees that had been growing undisturbed for centuries. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a loon or the splash of a beaver working somewhere along the shoreline. It was the kind of wilderness that made you feel like the first human to ever see it. The first 3 days of their survey proceeded normally. They collected soil samples, took magnetic readings, and used ground-penetrating radar to map subsurface formations. The area showed promise for rare mineral deposits, particularly unusual concentrations of metals that didn't appear on any geological charts of the region. It was on their 4th night that things began to change. Thompson was reviewing the day's data in his tent when he noticed that all of their electronic equipment was displaying anomalous readings. Compasses spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. GPS units showed their location as being in the middle of Hudson Bay, hundreds of miles from their actual position. Even their satellite phone couldn't establish a connection, despite clear skies and optimal atmospheric conditions. Dr. Kim emerged from her tent, holding a mineral scanner that was beeping incessantly. The device was designed to detect metal concentrations in soil samples, but it was reacting as if they were surrounded by massive deposits of unknown elements. The readings were off the charts, indicating the presence of materials that shouldn't exist in nature. Rivera's seismic equipment was going haywire as well. The sensors were picking up vibrations that seemed to be coming from deep underground, but the patterns didn't match any known geological activity. The frequencies were too regular, too purposeful, almost like some kind of artificial signal being transmitted through the bedrock itself. As the team gathered around their equipment table, trying to make sense of the anomalous readings, Jennifer pointed toward the lake. The water, which had been mirror still all week, was now displaying a faint phosphorescent glow. Ripples moved across its surface in perfect concentric circles, as if something large was moving beneath the water. The glow intensified, and they could see that it wasn't coming from the water itself, but from something submerged in the depths of the lake. The light pulsed rhythmically, growing brighter and dimmer in a pattern that seemed almost like breathing. As they watched, transfixed, the source of the light began to rise. What emerged from the lake defied every principle of physics Thompson had ever learned. It was enormous, easily 200 feet in diameter, shaped like a flattened sphere with a crystalline surface that seemed to shift and flow like liquid while maintaining its structural integrity. Water cascaded off its sides as it rose silently into the air, creating waterfalls that caught the strange light and cast rainbow patterns across the surrounding forest. The craft, for that's what it clearly was, hovered about 50 feet above the lake's surface, rotating slowly on its axis. As it turned, they could see that its surface wasn't smooth but covered in intricate patterns that resembled circuit boards or neural networks. These patterns pulsed with different colors, creating waves of light that swept across the craft's hull in mesmerizing displays. None of the team members could speak. They stood frozen at the edge of their camp, watching something that challenged every assumption they had about technology, about what was possible, about their place in the universe. The craft made no sound, generated no visible exhaust or energy discharge, yet it maintained its position in the air with perfect stability. Then it began to move toward them, not quickly, but with deliberate purpose, closing the distance between the lake and their campsite with fluid grace. As it approached, Thompson felt a familiar sensation, a pressure in his head similar to what he'd experienced at high altitudes, but more intense and accompanied by a low humming that seemed to vibrate through his bones. The craft stopped directly overhead, close enough that they could see fine details in its surface patterns. The crystalline material seemed to be alive, constantly shifting and reconfiguring itself in response to some internal logic. Streams of data appeared to flow through the patterns like blood through veins, carrying information in forms that human science couldn't begin to comprehend. A beam of soft golden light descended from the craft's underside, and Thompson felt himself being drawn upward, not physically lifted, but pulled by some force that affected his consciousness rather than his body. He was aware of leaving the ground, of passing through the beam of light, but the sensation was dreamlike, as if he were floating through warm honey. He found himself in a space that seemed impossibly large given the external dimensions of the craft. The walls, if they could be called walls, were composed of the same flowing crystalline material as the exterior, but here the patterns were even more complex, creating three-dimensional displays that showed star maps, molecular structures, and mathematical equations that were beyond his comprehension. His team was there with him, standing on what appeared to be a solid floor despite being surrounded by the flowing patterns of light and data. They looked around in wonder, their scientific training warring with the impossibility of what they were experiencing. Rivera kept reaching for his equipment, forgetting that they had left it all at the campsite far below. They were not alone in the space. Figures moved among the displays, tall and graceful beings, whose bodies seemed to be composed of the same crystalline material as their surroundings. These entities appeared to be tending to the information flows, manipulating data streams with gestures that caused the patterns to shift and evolve in response to their touch. One of the beings approached the team, and Thompson felt a familiar sensation of mental contact, similar to what other abductees had described, but more sophisticated, more nuanced. Instead of crude telepathy, this felt like direct data transfer, concepts and information flowing into his mind in organized packets that his consciousness could process and understand. The being conveyed that they were explorers, much like Thompson's own team, but operating on a scale that encompassed entire star systems rather than single planets. They had been monitoring Earth for millennia, studying the development of life and intelligence, cataloguing the planet's resources and potential. The unusual mineral deposits that had brought Thompson's team to this location weren't natural formations, the being explained. They were markers, beacons placed by previous survey missions to identify areas of particular interest. The metals that Dr. Kim's scanners had detected were elements that didn't exist naturally in Earth's crust, materials that had been introduced as part of a long-term terraforming experiment. This revelation was staggering. The being was telling them that Earth itself was a kind of laboratory, a world that had been subtly modified over geological time to support the development of complex life forms. Humanity wasn't alone in the universe, and their world wasn't the pristine natural environment they had always assumed it to be. But the most shocking information was yet to come. The being showed them images of other worlds, other species that had been discovered and studied in similar ways. Some had developed advanced civilizations that now worked alongside their discoverers, contributing to a galactic community of intelligence that spanned thousands of star systems. Others had failed to develop beyond primitive stages and had been allowed to evolve naturally until they were ready for contact. Humanity, the being suggested, was approaching a critical juncture in its development. The species had developed technology capable of detecting and potentially interfering with the monitoring systems that had been in place for so long. Soon, they would have to choose between revealing themselves openly or withdrawing to allow human civilization to develop without outside influence. The decision hadn't been made yet, the being conveyed, but it would come within the next few decades. How humanity responded to that revelation would determine their place in the larger community of intelligent species, or whether they would be left to develop in isolation until they were truly ready for contact. Thompson and his team were shown more of the craft's interior, spaces dedicated to different aspects of their research. There were laboratories where samples from Earth's biosphere were being analysed, comparing them to similar life forms found on other worlds. There were communication centres where data was being transmitted across impossible distances to other survey teams working throughout the galaxy. Most remarkably, there were what could only be described as cultural analysis centres, where human behaviour, art, music, and literature were being studied with the same intensity that human scientists might devote to studying the behaviour of dolphins or the migration patterns of birds. The beings were trying to understand not just humanity's biological development, but the emergence of consciousness, creativity, and the complex social structures that made human civilization unique. The team was allowed to observe these studies, watching as their abductors analysed everything from ancient cave paintings to modern digital communications. The beings seemed particularly fascinated by human concepts of beauty, love, and sacrifice, qualities that appeared to be rare among intelligent species, and which they were having difficulty understanding despite their advanced technology. Dr. Kim was drawn to the biological research areas, where she observed analysis techniques that made human laboratory methods seem crude by comparison. The beings could examine living cells without damaging them, trace genetic changes across millions of years of evolution, and predict how species would adapt to environmental changes with stunning accuracy. Rivera found himself in spaces dedicated to geological and planetary analysis, where the beings monitored tectonic activity, climate patterns, and resource distribution across entire worlds. Their understanding of planetary systems was so advanced that they could predict natural disasters decades in advance and subtly influence geological processes to prevent catastrophic events. Jennifer, as the youngest member of the team, seemed to be of particular interest to their hosts. She was taken to areas where the beings studied human learning and cognitive development, observing how knowledge was acquired and processed by different individuals. The attention she received suggested that the beings were especially interested in understanding how human intelligence developed over time. Throughout their time aboard the craft, the team retained their ability to communicate with each other, though they found that they could also understand the beings' communications directly. The entities seemed pleased by their guests' scientific backgrounds, treating them more as colleagues than as test subjects. This collaborative atmosphere made the experience less traumatic than many abduction accounts, but it also raised profound ethical questions. Were they willing participants in this research, or were they being manipulated into cooperation by technologies beyond their understanding? Did humanity have any right to consent to or refuse this long-term study of their species? The beings seemed to anticipate these concerns, conveying that the research had always been conducted with the goal of eventual open contact. The secrecy was necessary only because premature revelation would have disrupted human development in unpredictable ways. They pointed to historical examples of what happened when advanced civilizations made contact with less developed ones, usually resulting in the destruction of the less advanced culture. But they also acknowledged that the secret couldn't be maintained much longer. Human technology was advancing to the point where the monitoring systems would be discovered, and human space exploration would soon reach levels where contact would be inevitable. The question was whether that contact should be gradual and carefully managed, or sudden and potentially traumatic. After what felt like hours, but was probably much less time, the team found themselves back at their campsite beside the lake. The craft was gone, the water was still, and their equipment was functioning normally again. But they weren't the same people who had been lifted from the shoreline earlier that night. Each team member had been changed by the experience, but not in ways that were immediately obvious. Thompson found that his understanding of geological processes had been subtly enhanced, allowing him to interpret rock formations and mineral distributions with an intuition that surprised his colleagues. His subsequent surveys yielded discoveries that established his reputation as one of the most successful exploration geologists of his generation. Dr. Kim's research into rare earth elements led to breakthroughs in materials science that revolutionized electronics and energy storage. Her insights into crystal structures and molecular arrangements seemed to come from nowhere, but they consistently proved accurate when tested in laboratory conditions. Rivera's geophysical surveys began detecting oil and mineral deposits that other teams had missed, and his understanding of seismic activity allowed him to predict earthquakes with unprecedented accuracy. His methods became standard practice in the field, though he never could fully explain how he had developed them. Jennifer's career took an unexpected turn toward astrobiology, the study of life in the universe. Her doctoral thesis on the conditions necessary for the development of complex life forms was groundbreaking, proposing models for planetary evolution that wouldn't be confirmed by mainstream science for another decade. But perhaps more importantly, all 4 team members became part of an informal network of individuals who had experienced similar encounters. They didn't seek each other out initially, but over the years they found themselves connected through professional relationships, conferences, and research collaborations with others who had been touched by the same phenomenon. This network operated quietly within the scientific community, sharing insights and discoveries that advanced human understanding in subtle but significant ways. They were careful never to reveal the true source of their knowledge, but their collective contributions accelerated human technological and scientific development in directions that seemed to prepare humanity for eventual contact with other intelligent species. The geological survey that had brought them to that remote lake was officially classified as unsuccessful, yielding no commercially viable mineral deposits. But the real discoveries made during those few days in the Canadian wilderness would influence human development for generations to come, even if the full truth of what they had learned couldn't yet be revealed. As we move deeper into these extraordinary accounts, we begin to see patterns emerging. Each encounter, whether experienced by individuals or groups, seems to serve multiple purposes. There's the immediate impact on those directly involved, but there's also a larger effect on human society as knowledge and insights gained during these experiences slowly filter into our collective understanding. Our next story takes us to a very different setting, where a commercial airline pilot's routine flight became anything but routine, and where the safety of hundreds of passengers depended on the restraint and wisdom of visitors whose technology could have easily overwhelmed human aviation systems. Captain Robert Stevens had been flying commercial aircraft for 23 years when he encountered something that made him question everything he thought he knew about controlled airspace and who might be sharing it with human pilots. It was a clear October evening in 1987. and he was at the controls of Flight 447, a Boeing 767 carrying 186 passengers from Denver to Chicago. The flight had been routine up to that point. They were cruising at 37,000 feet over the flat expanse of Nebraska, with perfect weather conditions and light air traffic. Stevens was an experienced pilot with over 15,000 flight hours, known for his calm professionalism and meticulous attention to safety protocols. His first officer, Linda Martinez, was equally skilled, and together they had flown hundreds of flights without incident. It was Martinez who first noticed the anomaly on their radar display. 3 objects appeared on the screen, flying in tight formation about 20 miles ahead of their position. The contacts were moving at their same altitude and appeared to be pacing their aircraft, maintaining a constant distance despite Flight 447's speed of 530 miles per hour. Stevens contacted air traffic control to inquire about the other aircraft, assuming they were military jets on a training exercise. But Denver Center had no record of any traffic in their vicinity, and the objects weren't showing up on ground-based radar systems. As far as air traffic control was concerned, Flight 447 was alone in that section of airspace. The objects moved closer, and Stevens was able to get visual contact through the cockpit windows. What he saw defied his understanding of aerodynamics and aircraft design. The 3 craft were unlike anything in military or civilian aviation, shaped like elongated teardrops with no visible wings, engines, or control surfaces. They flew in perfect formation, maintaining precise spacing without any apparent communication between them. More disturbing was their flight behavior. The objects would accelerate to speeds that should have been impossible for their size, then stop abruptly and hover motionless in the air before resuming their previous course. They performed maneuvers that would have subjected any human occupants to G-forces far beyond what the human body could survive. Stevens found himself in an unprecedented situation. His aircraft was carrying nearly 200 passengers who were unaware of what was happening outside their windows. His responsibility was to ensure their safety while dealing with unknown aircraft that were operating in complete violation of all aviation regulations and physical laws. He made the decision to maintain course and altitude while carefully monitoring the unknown objects. Any sudden maneuvers could have endangered his passengers, and the strange craft hadn't shown any hostile intent. They seemed content to observe Flight 447 from a respectful distance, matching its speed and heading without interfering with its flight path. But as they passed over the Missouri border, the situation escalated. The 3 objects suddenly accelerated and positioned themselves around Flight 447, one directly ahead, one to port, and one to starboard. They maintained perfect formation with the airliner, as if escorting it through controlled airspace. The passengers began to notice the unusual escort. Flight attendants reported that people were pointing out the windows and asking questions about the strange aircraft flying alongside them. Stevens made a brief announcement, explaining that they were observing military aircraft on a training exercise. But he could tell that some passengers weren't convinced by his explanation. Martinez was monitoring their instruments carefully, watching for any signs that the unknown objects were affecting Flight 447's systems. What she discovered was both reassuring and deeply unsettling. Not only were their systems unaffected, they were performing better than normal. Engine efficiency was up, navigation systems were more precise than usual, and even the aircraft's autopilot seemed to be operating with enhanced accuracy. It was as if the presence of the unknown craft was somehow optimizing Flight 447's performance, making subtle adjustments to improve fuel efficiency and flight stability. Stevens had never experienced anything like it in over 2 decades of flying. The aircraft felt more responsive, more perfectly balanced than it ever had before. The escort continued for nearly an hour, with the 3 objects maintaining their positions around the airliner with mechanical precision. Stevens and Martinez took turns observing them through binoculars, trying to discern any details about their construction or occupants. The craft appeared to be solid, with metallic surfaces that reflected the setting sun, but they showed no lights. no markings, no indication of national origin. As they approached Chicago airspace, the objects began to change their behavior. They moved further away from Flight 447, increasing their distance while still maintaining the same heading and altitude. Stevens reported their presence to Chicago Approach Control, but once again, ground radar showed no contacts other than his own aircraft. The final phase of the encounter was the most dramatic. As Flight 447 began its descent toward O'Hare International Airport, the three objects suddenly climbed vertically at an impossible rate of acceleration. Stevens watched through his cockpit windows as they disappeared into the darkening sky, moving faster than any rocket he had ever seen. But they left behind a gift. As Flight 447 continued its approach to O'Hare, Stevens realized that his aircraft's fuel consumption had been dramatically reduced during the encounter. They had burned nearly 30% less fuel than normal for a flight of that distance, despite maintaining standard cruising speed and altitude. The fuel savings were so significant that it couldn't be explained by favorable winds or optimal routing. More remarkably, several passengers who had been suffering from various medical conditions reported feeling significantly better during and after the flight. An elderly man with severe arthritis found that his joint pain had disappeared entirely. A woman who had been undergoing chemotherapy treatment said she felt stronger and more energetic than she had in months. A child with severe asthma breathed easily for the first time in years. These improvements weren't temporary. Follow-up medical examinations confirmed that the passengers had experienced genuine, lasting improvements in their health conditions. Doctors were baffled by the recoveries, unable to explain what could have caused such dramatic improvements during a routine commercial flight. Stevens and Martinez filed a detailed report with the Federal Aviation Administration, documenting everything they had observed during the encounter. The FAA conducted a thorough investigation, interviewing passengers and crew members, analyzing radar data, and examining Flight 447's maintenance records. They found no evidence of equipment malfunction or pilot error, but they also couldn't explain the encounter. The official conclusion was that Stevens and Martinez had observed experimental military aircraft, despite the military's denial of any operations in that area. The fuel efficiency improvements were attributed to unusually favorable atmospheric conditions, and the passenger health improvements were dismissed as coincidental or psychosomatic. But Stevens knew what he had seen, and he wasn't alone. Over the following months, he was contacted by other commercial pilots who had experienced similar encounters. A United Airlines captain reported being escorted by unknown aircraft over the Pacific Ocean. A cargo pilot described objects that paced his aircraft across the Atlantic, improving fuel efficiency and navigation accuracy just as Stevens had experienced. These pilots formed an informal network, sharing information about encounters that they couldn't report through official channels without risking their careers. They discovered that such incidents were far more common than the public realized, but that the aviation industry's culture of strict regulation and safety protocols discouraged pilots from reporting anything that couldn't be easily explained. Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, an aerospace engineer who specialized in aircraft performance optimization, became interested in these reports when she noticed patterns in fuel consumption data from various airlines. Flights that reported encounters with unknown aircraft consistently showed improved efficiency ratings that couldn't be explained by conventional factors. Her analysis revealed that these improvements weren't random, but followed specific patterns that suggested the presence of some kind of external assistance. The aircraft weren't just flying more efficiently, they were being actively helped by technologies that could optimize their performance in real time. Dr. Vasquez's research eventually came to the attention of government agencies responsible for aviation safety and national security. While her findings couldn't be made public due to classification concerns, They contributed to a growing body of evidence that unknown aircraft were regularly operating in controlled airspace, apparently without any hostile intent. The implications were staggering. If these craft possessed technology capable of improving aircraft performance and healing human ailments, their level of advancement was far beyond anything in human capability. Yet they seemed to be using their abilities to help rather than harm, quietly improving the safety and efficiency of human aviation while remaining largely invisible to official detection systems. Stevens continued flying for another 8 years after his encounter, and he reported several more incidents involving unknown aircraft. Each time, his aircraft performed better than normal, and passengers frequently reported feeling unusually well during and after the flights. He began to suspect that these encounters weren't random, but that certain aircraft or routes were being specifically chosen for these interactions. His suspicions were confirmed during his final encounter as a commercial pilot. In 1995, while flying a red-eye flight from Los Angeles to New York, Stevens was again escorted by unknown craft. But this time, one of the objects moved close enough to his cockpit that he could see inside through what appeared to be transparent sections of its hull. The occupants were humanoid, but clearly not human, with elongated features and large eyes that seemed to glow with their own inner light. One of them appeared to acknowledge Stevens directly, raising what might have been a hand in a gesture that seemed unmistakably like a farewell salute. Stevens understood then that his flying career was being honored in some way, that his years of service to aviation safety and his discreet handling of these encounters had earned him recognition from intelligences far beyond human understanding. It was both humbling and deeply moving, a validation that his commitment to protecting passengers had been observed and appreciated by watchers whose own commitment to human welfare operated on a scale he was only beginning to comprehend. After retiring from commercial aviation, Stevens became a consultant for pilot training programs, quietly teaching new aviators to be observant, open-minded, and discreet about phenomena they might encounter in the skies. He never spoke publicly about his experiences, but his influence helped create a generation of pilots who were better prepared to handle extraordinary situations with professionalism and wisdom. The encounters reported by Stevens and other commercial pilots represent a different category of contact than the more dramatic abduction experiences we've examined. These seem designed to minimize disruption while maximizing benefit, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social structures. But as our next account will demonstrate, not all encounters follow such gentle patterns. Sometimes, contact occurs under circumstances that test human courage and adaptability to their absolute limits, revealing capabilities we didn't know we possessed. Our fifth account brings us to the remote wilderness of Alaska, where a scientific research team studying climate change discovered that their isolated weather station had attracted visitors whose interest in Earth's atmospheric conditions far exceeded their own understanding of what they were measuring. Dr. Amanda Walsh had spent 3 months at the Denali Research Station, a facility so remote that supply drops only occurred every 6 weeks. The station monitored atmospheric conditions, ice core samples, and permafrost changes as part of a comprehensive study of Arctic climate patterns. She worked alongside 2 colleagues, Dr. James Chen, an atmospheric physicist, and Maria Santos, a graduate student specializing in glaciology. The station consisted of 3 interconnected modules that served as laboratory, living quarters, and communication center. Solar panels and wind generators provided power, while sophisticated instruments continuously recorded temperature, humidity, wind patterns, and atmospheric composition. It was exactly the kind of isolated, high-tech facility that seemed to attract unexplained phenomena. The first indication that something unusual was happening came through their data streams. Dr. Chen noticed that their atmospheric sensors were detecting trace gases that shouldn't have existed at those concentrations in the Arctic atmosphere. The readings showed elements and compounds that were either extremely rare in nature or completely synthetic. yet they appear to be present in measurable quantities throughout the region. More puzzling was the pattern of these detections. The unusual readings occurred in cycles that corresponded to no known natural phenomena. They would spike for several hours, then return to normal levels, following a schedule that seemed almost artificial in its precision. Chen spent days checking and recalibrating their instruments, but the readings remained consistent. Dr. Walsh was analyzing ice core samples when she made an even more disturbing discovery. Layers of ice that had formed within the past decade contained microscopic particles that didn't match anything in their reference databases. Under electron microscopy, these particles appeared to be highly organized structures, almost like tiny machines, embedded throughout the ice matrix. The particles were geometrically perfect, with crystalline structures that suggested they had been manufactured rather than formed naturally. Chemical analysis revealed they were composed of elements not found in Earth's periodic table, arranged in configurations that defied current understanding of atomic physics. Yet somehow, these impossible structures were stable and appeared to be actively interacting with their environment. Maria's glaciology work revealed that the permafrost in their study area was behaving strangely. Despite rising temperatures that should have accelerated melting, certain sections of permanently frozen ground remained stable, while others melted at rates far exceeding climate models. The pattern wasn't random, but seemed to follow specific geographical lines that didn't correspond to any known geological features. 3 weeks into their residency, the team experienced their first direct encounter. They were working late in the laboratory module when all their instruments began displaying readings that were off the charts. Electromagnetic sensors showed massive energy signatures moving through the area, while seismic equipment detected vibrations that seemed to come from directly overhead rather than from the ground. Dr. Walsh stepped outside to investigate and found herself looking up at a sight that challenged every assumption she had about atmospheric physics. The aurora borealis, which had been a faint green shimmer on the northern horizon, suddenly intensified into a brilliant display that filled the entire sky. But these weren't normal northern lights. The aurora was moving in patterns that were too organized, too purposeful to be natural. Spirals of colored light swept across the sky in mathematical precision, creating geometric forms that pulsed with energy. The display was so bright that it cast shadows on the snow-covered landscape, turning night into an eerie artificial day. As Walsh watched, transfixed by the impossible light show, she became aware that the aurora was descending. What had been a high-altitude atmospheric phenomenon was now moving down toward the surface, approaching their research station with deliberate intent. The lights began to coalesce into more solid forms, taking on the appearance of craft or vehicles composed entirely of organized energy. Chen and Maria emerged from the laboratory, drawn by the intensity of the light outside. All 3 researchers stood in the Arctic cold, watching as beings of pure energy descended from the transformed aurora. These entities maintained humanoid shapes, but seemed to be composed of the same colored light that filled the sky, their forms shifting and flowing like liquid electricity. The encounter that followed was unlike any of the previous accounts we've examined. These beings didn't use spacecraft or technology in any conventional sense. They were the technology, existing as organized patterns of energy that could manipulate matter and physics at will. Their presence transformed the entire environment around the research station, turning the harsh Arctic landscape into something resembling an alien garden. The snow beneath their feet became warm and soft, while the air filled with the scent of flowers that couldn't possibly exist in such conditions. The aurora continued to dance overhead, but now it seemed to be responding to the thoughts and emotions of the researchers, creating visual representations of concepts and feelings that were too complex for words. Communication with these energy beings was immediate and overwhelming. They didn't speak or use telepathy in the way other entities had been described. Instead, They seemed to share their entire consciousness directly, flooding the researchers' minds with knowledge and understanding that spanned millions of years of observation and experience. The beings revealed that they had been monitoring Earth's climate systems since the planet first developed its atmosphere. They existed primarily as patterns of electromagnetic energy, able to travel through space at the speed of light and manipulate matter through direct quantum interaction. They had watched the rise and fall of countless civilizations, not just on Earth, but throughout the galaxy. Their interest in the research station wasn't coincidental. Climate change represented a critical juncture in Earth's development, one that would determine whether human civilization survived or joined the countless species that had failed to adapt to changing conditions. The beings had been subtly influencing atmospheric conditions for decades, trying to slow the rate of change while humanity developed the technology and wisdom necessary to address the crisis. The microscopic particles that Dr. Walsh had found in the ice cores were their tools, quantum-scale devices that could influence weather patterns, ocean currents, and atmospheric chemistry. These particles were constantly at work, moderating temperature fluctuations, redirecting storm systems, and maintaining the delicate balance that kept Earth's climate from spiraling into complete chaos. But their ability to intervene was limited by laws that governed their species' interaction with developing civilizations. They could provide subtle assistance, but they couldn't prevent humanity from experiencing the consequences of its own actions. The choice of how to respond to climate change had to come from humans themselves, based on their own understanding and values. The beings showed the researchers visions of possible futures, scenarios that ranged from complete environmental collapse to technological breakthroughs that would allow humanity to not only survive, but thrive in harmony with their planet's natural systems. The path between these extremes was narrow and required immediate action based on accurate understanding of Earth's climate systems. This was why they had revealed themselves to the research team. The data being collected at stations like Denali was crucial for humanity's understanding of what was happening to their planet. But the beings could enhance that data, providing insights and measurements that human technology couldn't achieve alone. Over the following hours, the researchers' instruments were upgraded in ways that defied explanation. Sensors that had been capable of detecting parts per million suddenly could measure individual molecules. Computers that had processed data in megabytes now operated at quantum speeds that made their previous capabilities seem primitive. But more than technology was enhanced. The researchers themselves were changed. Their understanding of atmospheric science and climate systems expanded far beyond what any human education could provide. They gained intuitive knowledge of weather patterns, ocean dynamics, and the complex feedback loops that regulated Earth's temperature and atmospheric composition. Dr. Chen found himself able to predict weather patterns weeks in advance with perfect accuracy, not through mathematical modeling, but through a direct understanding of how energy moved through atmospheric systems. His subsequent research would revolutionize meteorology, leading to weather prediction capabilities that saved countless lives through improved disaster preparedness. Dr. Walsh's analysis of ice core data became legendary in the field of paleoclimatology. She could read the history of Earth's climate in ice samples like others read books, discerning patterns and relationships that had been invisible to previous researchers. Her work provided crucial evidence for understanding how rapidly climate could change, and what factors might accelerate or moderate those changes. Maria's glaciology research led to breakthroughs in understanding permafrost dynamics that helped predict which Arctic regions would remain stable and which would release massive amounts of stored carbon as temperatures rose. Her models became essential tools for climate scientists worldwide, helping them understand one of the most critical factors in future warming scenarios. But perhaps most importantly, all three researchers became advocates for immediate and dramatic action on climate change. They couldn't reveal the true source of their enhanced understanding, but they could use their scientific credibility to push for policies and technologies that might prevent the worst-case scenarios they had witnessed. The energy beings departed as the aurora returned to its normal patterns, but they left behind more than enhanced instruments and expanded knowledge. They had planted seeds of understanding that would grow and spread throughout the scientific community, accelerating human comprehension of climate systems at exactly the moment when such understanding was most desperately needed. The Denali Research Station continued its work, but now with capabilities that far exceeded any other climate monitoring facility on Earth. The data it provided became essential for international climate negotiations, offering measurements and projections that were more accurate than anything previously available. Years later, as the reality of climate change became undeniable and human civilization began taking serious steps to address the crisis, the three researchers understood that they had been part of something much larger than a scientific study. They had been chosen to receive knowledge that would help humanity navigate one of the most dangerous periods in its history. Their encounter represented a different kind of contact, one focused not on individual transformation, but on species survival. The energy beings had recognized that human civilization stood at a crossroads, and they had provided the information necessary to choose the path towards survival rather than extinction. This brings us to our sixth account, which takes us beneath the ocean's surface, where a deep-sea research submersible encountered inhabitants of Earth's least explored frontier, revealing that humanity shares this planet with intelligences that have been here far longer than our own species. Dr. Catherine Rivera had been piloting deep-sea research vehicles for 12 years when she descended to a depth that would forever change her understanding of what lived in Earth's deepest waters. She was operating the submersible Neptune's Eye at a depth of 3,200 meters in the Mariana Trench, conducting a biological survey of life forms that existed in the perpetual darkness of the deep ocean. The submersible was a marvel of engineering, capable of withstanding the crushing pressure of the deep sea while providing its pilot with sophisticated sensors and cameras to observe the alien world of the ocean depths. Dr. Rivera was accompanied by Dr. Marcus Webb, a marine biologist specializing in extremophile organisms, creatures that thrived in conditions that would be lethal to most life forms. Their mission was to collect samples from hydrothermal vents, underwater geysers that spewed superheated water rich in minerals and chemicals. These vents supported unique ecosystems that existed entirely independent of sunlight, deriving energy from chemical processes rather than photosynthesis. Scientists believed that similar environments might exist on other planets, making these deep-sea communities valuable analogues for potential extraterrestrial life. The descent to their target depth took nearly 2 hours, during which they passed through distinct layers of ocean life. The sunlit surface waters gave way to the twilight zone, where bioluminescent creatures created their own light in the gathering darkness. Below that lay the midnight zone, where no natural light penetrated and pressure reached levels that would instantly crush any surface-dwelling organism. At maximum depth, they entered a world that seemed more alien than anything in science fiction. Strange creatures drifted through the black water, their bodies adapted to pressures over 300 times greater than at sea level. Tube worms clustered around volcanic vents, while bizarre fish with luminous organs patrolled the rocky terrain of the seafloor. Dr. Rivera was maneuvering Neptune's Eye toward a particularly active hydrothermal vent when her sonar detected something that shouldn't have existed at that depth. The readings showed a large structured object about 500 meters ahead, too geometric to be a natural formation, yet too large to be human-made debris. As they approached the anomaly, their lights revealed what appeared to be a city, not ruins of some ancient civilization, but an active, functioning settlement built into the seafloor around a cluster of hydrothermal vents. Structures that looked like they had grown rather than been constructed rose from the ocean floor, their surfaces covered in what appeared to be cultivated organisms that provided both structural support and bioluminescent lighting. The architecture was unlike anything in human experience, following design principles that took advantage of the three-dimensional nature of the underwater environment. Buildings spiraled upward in helical patterns, connected by tunnel-like passages that wove between the structures in complex networks. The entire settlement pulsed with organized light patterns that seemed to serve as both illumination and communication. Dr. Webb was frantically taking photographs and video recordings, but the images seemed inadequate to capture the impossible reality of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a collection of buildings. It was a thriving ecosystem where technology and biology had merged into something that transcended both. As Neptune's eye moved closer to the settlement, they became aware that they were being observed. Creatures emerged from the structures, but these weren't the primitive deep-sea life forms they had expected to find. These beings were clearly intelligent, with streamlined bodies adapted for underwater movement and large eyes that seemed designed to gather and process the faintest traces of light. The beings approached the submersible with curious caution, swimming in coordinated groups that suggested sophisticated social organization. Their movements were graceful and purposeful, demonstrating intelligence that was clearly on par with human capability, yet adapted to an environment that humans could only visit briefly in protective vessels. Dr. Rivera found herself face to face with one of the beings through Neptune's eye's observation window. The creature was about the size of a human, with pale, translucent skin that revealed complex internal structures. Its eyes were enormous, taking up nearly a third of its head, and seemed to contain depths that reflected not just light, but intelligence and curiosity. The being extended what appeared to be a limb toward the submersible's hull, and Dr. Rivera felt a strange vibration through the vessel's structure. It wasn't sound in any conventional sense, but rather a direct transmission of meaning that bypassed language entirely. The being was attempting to communicate, using vibrations that traveled through the water and the submersible's hull to convey concepts and emotions. What followed was humanity's first documented conversation with a truly alien intelligence that had evolved on Earth itself. The beings, as Dr. Rivera began to understand through their vibrational communication, had been living in the deep ocean for millions of years, developing a civilization that existed in complete independence from the surface world. They had watched the rise of life in the sunlit waters above, observed the evolution of land-dwelling creatures, and witnessed the emergence of human civilization. But they had remained hidden, developing their own technology and culture in the isolated depths where pressure and darkness created a barrier that surface dwellers could not cross. Their technology was based on biological principles that were completely alien to human engineering. Instead of building machines, they cultivated organisms that performed technological functions. Their cities were living entities that grew and adapted to changing conditions. Their vehicles were creatures that had been bred for specific purposes, capable of traveling through the ocean depths at speeds that human submarines couldn't match. The beings showed Dr. Rivera and Dr. Webb their city, guiding Neptune's eye through passages that revealed the full scope of their civilization. There were areas dedicated to what could only be called agriculture, where they cultivated organisms for food and materials. There were libraries of sorts, where information was stored in the genetic codes of specially bred creatures that could be accessed through biochemical processes. Most remarkably, there were nurseries where young beings were educated not through books or lectures, but through direct biological transfer of knowledge and skills. The entire society functioned as a single organism, with individuals contributing to the collective while maintaining their own unique identities and capabilities. The beings revealed that they had been aware of human deep-sea exploration for decades, watching as submarines and research vessels probed deeper into their domain. They had made the decision to reveal themselves to Dr. Rivera's team because they recognized that human activity was beginning to affect even the deepest parts of the ocean. Climate change, pollution, and deep-sea mining were altering the chemical composition of the deep waters and disrupting the delicate ecosystems that the beings depended on for survival. They needed to establish communication with surface dwellers to prevent irreversible damage to their world, but they also had something to offer in return. Their understanding of biological systems and their ability to manipulate life at the genetic level could provide solutions to many of humanity's most pressing problems. They could help develop organisms that would clean pollution from the oceans, create new sources of food that could grow in harsh environments, and even assist in medical treatments that worked with the body's natural healing processes rather than against them. The encounter lasted for nearly 6 hours, during which Dr. Rivera and Dr. Webb received an education in biology and ecology that revolutionized their understanding of life on Earth. They learned that the deep ocean wasn't a barren wasteland, but a thriving ecosystem that was far more complex and interconnected than surface scientists had ever imagined. The beings also revealed that they weren't alone. Similar civilizations existed in deep waters throughout the world's oceans, connected by migration routes and communication networks that spanned the globe. The deep sea was inhabited by multiple intelligent species, each adapted to specific environments and depths, forming a planetary society that had existed in secret for millions of years. When Neptune's eye finally began its ascent to the surface, Dr. Rivera and Dr. Webb carried with them biological samples that the beings had provided, along with information that would transform human understanding of marine biology. But they also carried the weight of a secret that could revolutionize human civilization while potentially destroying the hidden world they had discovered. The samples provided by the deep-sea beings led to breakthroughs in biotechnology that seemed to come from nowhere. New techniques for genetic engineering, revolutionary approaches to treating cancer and genetic diseases, and biological solutions to environmental problems all emerged from the research conducted on those mysterious specimens. Dr. Rivera became a leading advocate for ocean conservation, though she couldn't reveal the true reasons for her passionate commitment to protecting deep-sea environments. Her research expeditions, funded by organizations that didn't realize they were supporting diplomatic missions, established ongoing contact with the deep-sea civilizations. Dr. Webb's work in marine biology led to discoveries that earned him international recognition, but his greatest achievements remained classified. He served as a liaison between human scientists and the deep-sea beings, facilitating the careful exchange of knowledge that benefited both species while protecting the secrets of the underwater civilizations. The relationship that developed between humans and the deep-sea beings became a model for how contact between different intelligent species could be managed. It was gradual, carefully controlled, and focused on mutual benefit rather than dominance or exploitation. Both sides maintained their independence while sharing knowledge that advanced their respective civilizations. But perhaps most importantly, the encounter revealed that Earth was far more complex and inhabited than humans had ever imagined. Intelligence had evolved not just once, but multiple times, in environments so different from human experience that contact had been impossible until technology advanced to the point where the barriers could be crossed. As we continue our journey through these extraordinary accounts, we begin to see that contact with non-human intelligence takes many forms and serves many purposes. Each encounter seems designed to expand human understanding in specific ways, preparing our species for a future that will require us to think beyond the limitations of our current worldview. Our next account takes us to the Australian outback, where an Aboriginal family's ancient connection to the land allowed them to perceive visitors that others might have missed, and where traditional knowledge proved more valuable than modern technology in understanding what was happening. Tommy Nakamura had been living on his family's traditional land in the Great Sandy Desert for 67 years when the Star people returned, just as his grandmother had always said they would. The red dirt country of Western Australia stretched endlessly in all directions from their small community, a landscape that most outsiders saw as empty and hostile, but which Tommy and his family knew as intimately as the lines on their own hands. Tommy's granddaughter Sarah, a university-educated woman who worked as a cultural liaison between Aboriginal communities and government agencies, had come to visit during the dry season. She brought with her the skepticism of someone who had spent years in the city, viewing her grandfather's stories of the dream time and spirit ancestors as beautiful metaphors rather than literal truth. That perspective changed on a night when the desert sky was so clear that the Milky Way cast shadows on the ground, and the ancient songlines that crisscrossed the continent seemed to pulse with energy that made the air itself shimmer with possibility. Tommy had been teaching Sarah about the star maps that their people had used for navigation for thousands of generations, pointing out constellations that marked seasonal changes and ceremonial obligations. These weren't just stories to him, but living knowledge that connected his people to the cosmos in ways that Western astronomy couldn't comprehend. As they sat around their small campfire, Tommy suddenly stood and walked to the edge of their camp, staring intently at a section of sky that looked no different from any other to Sarah's untrained eyes. But Tommy saw something that made him begin singing in the old language, a song that Sarah had never heard before, ancient words that seemed to call something down from the star-filled darkness above. The response was immediate and unmistakable. Lights began to move among the stars, not the random streaking of meteors or the steady progression of satellites, but purposeful movement that followed patterns Sarah recognized from the traditional dances her grandfather had taught her as a child. The lights were dancing in the sky, responding to Tommy's song, with movements that matched the rhythm and melody of his ancient words. Sarah grabbed for her smartphone to record what was happening, but the device refused to function, its screen remaining black despite multiple attempts to activate it. Her digital camera was similarly unresponsive, as if the presence of the lights had created some kind of electromagnetic field that interfered with modern technology. But Tommy seemed unsurprised by this development. He continued his song, and the lights responded by descending closer to the ground, revealing themselves to be craft of impossible beauty and complexity. They weren't the cold, metallic objects that Sarah had seen in science fiction movies, but living things that seemed to be made of light itself, shifting and flowing like aurora given form and purpose. The largest craft settled gently onto the red sand about 50 meters from their camp, and figures emerged from its glowing interior. These beings moved with the fluid grace of dancers, their forms tall and slender, seeming to be composed of the same shifting light as their vessels. But there was something familiar about them, something that resonated with the deepest layers of Sarah's ancestral memory. Tommy walked toward them without fear, and Sarah followed, drawn by curiosity and the strange sense that this moment had been inevitable, written into the songlines of the land itself. As they approached, one of the beings stepped forward, and Sarah felt a profound shock of recognition. The being's features were elongated and refined, but unmistakably related to human facial structure. Its eyes held depths of intelligence and compassion that reminded her of her grandfather's gaze. And when it spoke, the words came not as sound but as meaning that appeared directly in her consciousness, delivered in the cadence and inflection of her grandmother's voice. "We have been waiting," the being conveyed, "for the time when the young ones would return to the old knowledge. The songs have been calling us back across the great distances, and now we can share what was always meant to be shared." Tommy nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense and began speaking in the old language, words that Sarah only partially understood, but which seemed to flow from some deep well of inherited knowledge. The being responded in kind, and Sarah realized she was witnessing a conversation that had been interrupted not years or decades ago, but centuries. Through fragments of understanding and sudden flashes of inherited memory, Sarah began to grasp that these beings weren't visitors from another world, but relatives who had left Earth long ago, when the ice was retreating and the great herds were disappearing. They had promised to return when their earthbound family had grown wise enough to join them among the stars. The night that followed was unlike anything in Sarah's experience. She was taken aboard the light craft, not through any kind of abduction, but as an honored guest being shown the achievements of distant cousins. The interior of the vessel was vast, far larger than its external dimensions should have allowed, filled with gardens of impossible beauty, where plants from 100 worlds grew in harmony. The beings showed her their history, the long journey they had taken through the galaxy, establishing homes on worlds that circled distant suns while maintaining their connection to Earth, through the songlines that connected all consciousness across space and time. They had watched human civilization develop, sometimes intervening subtly to prevent disasters that would have ended the species too early, always waiting for the moment when contact could be re-established. That moment had come because people like Tommy had kept the old knowledge alive, maintaining the songs and stories that served as beacons calling across the cosmic distances. The beings explained that every indigenous culture on Earth carried fragments of this ancient wisdom, star maps and ceremonies that were actually communication protocols for reaching civilizations that had spread throughout the galaxy. Sarah learned that her ancestors hadn't just been hunter-gatherers, struggling to survive in a harsh landscape, but the keepers of humanity's most important knowledge, guardians of the connection between Earth and the greater community of intelligent life that existed among the stars. The Dreamtime wasn't mythology, but a description of the quantum field that connected all consciousness, the medium through which thought and knowledge could travel instantly across any distance. The beings showed her other worlds where human descendants lived, planets where the environment had been carefully shaped to support life that was recognizably human, but adapted to alien conditions. They showed her spacefaring civilizations that traced their origins back to Earth, star-traveling peoples who had never forgotten their connection to the red dirt country, where consciousness had first awakened to its cosmic nature. But they also showed her the challenges that lay ahead. Earth was approaching a critical period in its development, a time when humanity would either learn to live in harmony with their planet and take their place in the galactic community, or destroy themselves through ignorance and conflict. The knowledge needed to make the right choice had been preserved in the traditional cultures that modern civilization often dismissed as primitive. Sarah understood then why she had been brought to witness this encounter. Her education in both traditional and modern knowledge made her uniquely qualified to serve as a bridge between the two worldviews, helping to translate ancient wisdom into terms that contemporary society could understand and accept. The beings gave her tools for this work, not physical devices, but expansions of consciousness that allowed her to perceive the connections between all living things, to understand the deep patterns that governed the relationship between mind and matter. She learned to read the songlines not just as navigation aids, but as actual pathways through space-time that connected Earth to every inhabited world in the galaxy. When dawn approached, and the beings prepared to return to their hidden bases among the outer planets, they left behind more than memories and expanded awareness. They gave Sarah and Tommy biological samples that would revolutionize understanding of genetics and evolution, showing how life had been seeded throughout the galaxy by intelligent design rather than random chance. They also provided star charts that were far more accurate than anything produced by human astronomy. Maps that showed not just the positions of stars and planets, but the locations of inhabited worlds and the civilizations that had established themselves throughout the local region of the galaxy. These charts revealed that Earth existed not in cosmic isolation, but as part of a vast community of intelligent species that had been waiting patiently for humanity to mature enough to join them. Sarah returned to her work as a cultural liaison with a deeper understanding of what that role truly meant. She became a voice for indigenous rights and environmental protection, but her advocacy was informed by knowledge that went far beyond political or economic considerations. She understood that the survival of traditional cultures was essential for humanity's future among the stars. Her research into Aboriginal astronomy and navigation led to discoveries that revolutionized archaeology and anthropology, revealing connections between indigenous cultures worldwide that suggested a common origin far more ancient and sophisticated than previously believed. Her work showed that the first humans hadn't been primitive survivors, but the inheritors of knowledge that had been carefully preserved through thousands of generations. Tommy lived for 12 more years after that night in the desert, and during that time, he shared knowledge with Sarah that had never been written down, songs and stories that contained scientific information about the nature of consciousness, the structure of space-time, and the techniques for communicating across cosmic distances. When he passed away, he did so with the satisfaction of knowing that the ancient knowledge would survive in someone who understood both its traditional context and its modern applications. Sarah eventually established a research institute that brought together indigenous knowledge keepers and cutting-edge scientists, creating a new field of study that merged traditional wisdom with quantum physics and consciousness research. The work conducted at this institute led to breakthroughs in communication technology, space travel, and understanding of the relationship between mind and matter. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah's encounter had shown her that humanity's future lay not in abandoning traditional knowledge for modern technology, but in integrating both into a more complete understanding of reality. The beings from the stars hadn't come to rescue humanity from its problems, but to remind them that they already possessed the knowledge needed to solve those problems, preserved in the songs and stories of peoples who had never forgotten their cosmic origins. Our journey through these remarkable accounts nears its end, but the patterns we've observed continue to point toward a future where contact between humanity and other intelligences becomes not just possible, but inevitable. Each story has revealed different aspects of this relationship, different ways that contact might unfold, and different challenges that such encounters might present. What emerges from all these testimonies is a picture of contact that is far more nuanced and complex than popular culture suggests. These aren't invasions or rescues, but careful, gradual interactions designed to prepare humanity for a larger role in a universe that is far more populated and interconnected than most people realize. The beings described in these accounts seem to understand that premature or traumatic contact could destroy rather than elevate human civilization. Instead, they appear to be conducting a long-term program of gradual revelation, working through individuals and small groups to plant seeds of knowledge and understanding that will grow and spread through human society over time. Each person whose story we've shared tonight has become part of this larger process, whether they fully understand their role or not. They've been changed by their experiences, given knowledge and abilities that they've used to advance human understanding in their respective fields. Collectively, their contributions are preparing our species for the moment when open contact becomes possible. But that moment requires more than just technological advancement or scientific understanding. It requires a fundamental shift in how humanity views itself and its place in the cosmos. We must evolve from seeing ourselves as the sole intelligent species in the universe to understanding that we're part of a vast community of conscious beings, each contributing their unique perspective to the ongoing evolution of intelligence itself. The encounters we've explored tonight suggest that this transformation is already underway, happening quietly in research laboratories and remote locations around the world. People are being prepared, knowledge is being shared, and the groundwork is being laid for a future that will challenge every assumption we currently hold about reality. Whether you believe these accounts represent literal truth or something more metaphorical, they point toward profound changes in human consciousness that are already beginning to manifest in our science, our technology, and our understanding of what it means to be human in an infinite universe. The visitors described in these stories seem to be waiting patiently for us to reach the point where we're ready for open contact. When that moment comes, It won't be through dramatic landings on the White House lawn or mass demonstrations of superior technology. Instead, it will be the natural culmination of a process that has been unfolding for decades, perhaps centuries, preparing humanity step by step for its role in a larger cosmic community. Until that time comes, we're left with these stories, these testimonies from people whose lives have been touched by something beyond our current understanding. Whether we choose to believe them or dismiss them, they serve as windows into possibilities that may be closer to reality than we dare to imagine. As we conclude tonight's journey through these extraordinary accounts, remember that the universe is vast beyond comprehension, filled with wonders that we're only beginning to discover. The experiences shared tonight remind us that we may not be as alone as we sometimes feel, and that intelligence and consciousness may be far more common in the cosmos than our current science suggests. Keep watching the skies, keep an open mind, and remember that sometimes the most extraordinary truths are found in the testimonies of ordinary people who've experienced something that changed their lives forever. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of the unknown. Sweet dreams, and may your own encounters with the mysteries of the universe be filled with wonder rather than fear.